I'm Chris DeLeon. This is sort of my concepts talk, sort of on common mistakes by new developers, stuff that sometimes people will spend months, sometimes years doing before they're like, why didn't someone explain such and such to me first? About planning, learning, and business in particular. Like I said, it's kind of more of a concepts talk. If you really want like a hands-on, code, practical, whatever kind of thing, codeyourfirstgame.com, with or without hyphens. I figure it's easier to read with hyphens. We'll take you straight to one of my free Udemy courses where you can like program a game tonight, just get going. All right, so a bit about my background. I've been making video games since the late 1990s, about 4 or 5 games a year. Many of those are small, free or side projects. Don't get the wrong idea. That doesn't include 7 months of daily digital prototypes nightly at interactionartist.com. I was technical game designer at EA for some console games, late 2000s. Made a bunch of iPhone games, about a dozen-ish. IndieCade finalist 5 years ago. Early hire with became top podcast San Francisco. Stupid Fun Club. Started some game clubs. Master thesis on pinball. If you want to talk about pinball, I will talk your off about pinball. Briefly taught in university, decided that's a wonderful place for all kinds of stuff and just not the kind of teaching environment that I find conducive to my format. So now I teach worldwide one-on-one over Skype, also through video courses. That's my GameKeto brand, the GK you see in the corner. And I'm starting a club here in Los Angeles, so if any of y'all are local, you can check out lagamedevs.com and come make games with us there. That'd be awesome. Here's some of my worldwide peoples, but the Skype thing's kind of fun. So a lot of the context for this talk today is the club kind of projects. They're very much beginner kind of projects. I've overseen now hundreds of these things at various levels of involvement, sometimes making sounds, sometimes just putting the structures in place for them, sometimes leading them. And so I will be saying some relatively harsh things. I've got sort of a tough love mentality after enough years of seeing people waste their time and be sad. So I'm afraid of this Bill Gove thing of you've got to tell people the truth. That's the only way to give people a fighting chance. Theoretically, it would be in my best business interest to tell everyone that, like, making games will make you millions of dollars. Pay me to teach you to make games. I am usually on the other side of the spectrum where this is not a golden ticket scenario. I suspect people, by the fact that you're at GameU, by the fact you're at IndieCade, are past this already. But I like to just clarify that thing where like, there's a flight control article in New York Times and this is the new way to get rich. It super isn't. There were 1,100 Xbox 360 games ever made, distinct-ish. There were 850 NES games ever made, distinct-ish. That includes like international imports, etc. There are 750 new mobile games released every single day. That's mobile only, not including online, not including other channels, and so on. You're literally every day competing against an avalanche of like the history of any console, retro or modern, as far as the number of new games getting made. At this point, being like, I'm going to make games, that is as much a business plan as like I'm going to buy a guitar, learn to play guitar, and like there are short-term ways to make a business out of that, but it's typically not what people are picturing when they're like, yes, my business strategy is blank. So I'm a big fan of this thing. Of course, it's originally about marriage counseling from Arrested Development. Going full-time indie dev, can that actually work? Oh, it almost never does, but somehow these people delude themselves into thinking it will. But it just might work for us. But it's not like, I think the important thing to distinguish isn't that you're necessarily like, I'm bad at it, or I'm fated to ill opportunities or whatever. It's to embrace the fact that sucking at something is the first step to becoming sort of good at something. That is going to be a part of the process. And along the way, how can we spare some pain and some troubles as we go? The first off is to not listen to what people say they want. Lots and lots of people will say that they love originality, they want original things, they want something like they've never seen before. Most new things are awful. Most new things are bad. And when you ask that same person what their favorite game is, it's almost always a sequel or like the 12th game deep into a genre that's now well established. Those things are effectively recipes of what people like and understand and can wrap their mind around. And I use this House example not only because everybody lies, but also because there's a show that was so formulaic, and everyone hated how formulaic it was. So one season they tried to deviate from the formula, worst season of that show. There's something to be said for like we as people like that we get a certain kind of taco and go to a certain kind of restaurant, and that's what we know we want. And no one really hates The Walking Dead because they didn't invent zombies, they didn't invent Atlanta, they didn't invent sheriffs or whatever. It's because they're doing a darn good job of what they have. Now I also raise that example though because it's a useful case of talking a little bit about red ocean versus blue ocean strategy. And this is maybe not an immediate concern, but it's something to have on the periphery of your horizon thinking, where red ocean thinking is all about sort of blood in the water. These are typically marketing terms of heavy, large businesses are in this space. This is the Call of Duties, this is the Electronic Arts, this is the Zyngas. These are spaces where they're making types of games where the barrier to entry is maybe a $500 million budget for marketing. Now the blue ocean market space is where there are things that are typically uncontested, and that is something where it's off the radar, they're not there, either they're not there yet, maybe they abandoned that space, but it's just not in their interest, it's not in the periphery. And one of the neat things about this is that the games we think are enormously successful at the indie scale, we're like, yes, point-and-click adventures are finally commercializable again, would pay for like less than a week or two of Electronic Arts time for their 19 campuses worldwide and 9,000 employees, including lawyers and forklift drivers and everything along the spectrum. They don't care at the scale that we do. If you're splitting money 4 ways, 2 ways, 12 ways, it's a much different game than paying for facilities of that kind of nature and a different kind of scale. So you want to stay off their radar. So it's useful to notice that even the grand slam, absolutely successful, enormously well-known indie games look and play nothing like the AAA stuff. These aren't like shoddy versions of Call of Duty. These aren't like an EA game, except they are fundamentally weird things. That it's sort of just a weird kind of exception where Microsoft would swoop in and acquire Mojang and whatnot for this particular game and its success. Because at the time when they were doing this, it was just completely none of them cared. They couldn't even justify like putting an internal and tinkering on this kind of stuff at the time. Now, where those processes come from typically is not a lot of clever planning. Planning documentation used to be valuable when hardware was awful, processes were slow, so we just saw Jeremy Gibson put together an Asteroid-style game in an hour and a half. Pac-Man originally took a team of people. It's led by Toru Otani, everyone knows that, but it was a team of about 9 engineers, professional software engineers and hardware engineers, a year to develop that game, because they had to ship these cabinets worldwide, and once they released it, they couldn't make any updates. And there's all kinds of challenges on that old process for an arcade. Modern hardware is great, and an amateur can throw out Pac-Man in hours, at the very least a weekend, using modern tools. So instead, I focus on my design docs, typically are like a mock-up screenshot of like, okay, how big is the character on the screen? What's our camera angle? What's my basic level structure? What information am I showing on the HUD? Is there an ammo count? Is there a life counter? Is there a score counter? These give immediate ways to give everyone on the team on the same page of what kind of thing we're building. The building process kind of becomes putting that screenshot to life, and then maybe a half page of bullet points. But that's because if you had a big document, and we've tried games with big documents, about 2 or 3 pages in, it all becomes lies anyway, because like you're starting to play the game, and it just fundamentally works differently on a computer than it did on paper and in your brain. Prototyping is something I'm a huge fan of, but I especially like to distinguish that prototyping isn't just a euphemism for failed project. Prototyping is actually a specific thing we do where we're building to answer questions, or we're building to create a demonstration to people on our team of what sort of thing we have in mind, or we're building a thing to help get maybe an investor or someone else's attention of, look, I have traction in this is a real thing, this can work, people respond to it, it does its job. But it's not to just be treated as like, here's something I kind of started, I don't have a pile of prototypes, I might have a pile of abandoned projects. Prototype is a specific, purposeful thing we do to answer questions through building, and is totally worthwhile and people should, I believe, do. Now, in terms of thinking of what we can prototype at our scale, it's often helpful to borrow from history, because there were many things where they used to have to cut corners for technological reasons. So we had lots of games with a black background because that was the color of the monitor, and they couldn't have a very high refresh rate. Early on, lots of the deathmatch games were in vehicles, because at that poly count and that texture resolution, animated people are completely unpresentable. But these also work in our favor of these are also the kind of games you can slap together pretty quickly with modern sort of indie tools, indie environments, because of how few people they require, because of how low resolution things are. There's fewer ways to shoot yourself in the foot, and you can kind of get a game together faster as a foundation to start then building in and thinking concretely about what are my power-ups, how do my enemies move in response to where the player is, how are my level spaces laid out, and other sort of very meaty, real design questions as opposed to these kind of theoretical arguments of hypotheticals. Chris Crawford referred to this back in the 80s. Chris Crawford was several decades ahead of his time, as sort of working with the grain of the wood, which is sort of the carpenter term for once you've worked with wood, you know there's ways that are way easier to cut wood, and there's also ways you can use wood that are much better at load bearing and also look better. And it's the same reason why I'm a big fan of designers, even if you want to identify mainly as a game designer, not as a programmer, learning to program some stuff. Maybe it's just a prototype level, but learning to program some stuff will help you learn an appreciation of exactly what these materials, that being our laptops, etc., do especially easily, especially well, especially naturally, and where and when we might strategically have to go out of our way to do something weird with it, but we can make that choice consciously and be smart about it. And again, I think the best place to borrow from these is historical examples of, on NES, they had to use a tile-based system to make a big scrolling world out of like the 4 or 5 little sprite squares they could use. Of course, famously here, the bush is exactly the same sprite as the cloud. They were literally that strapped for memory. Whereas modern indie games still use tile-based systems because with modern processors, they can support tons of flying, bouncing particles and tons of enemies and tons of moving objects, and also have a kind of a pretty better environment, one that's easier to iterate on the design process where designers can very quickly move these pieces around. In the same way also as children can build things in Minecraft that look presentable because there's always so many ways to screw up symmetry when 1 meter blocks, tile systems force us to a grid, which is this very natural, eye-appealing, designery thing that without it, it gets real sloppy real fast about why this is 1 pixel over and why that isn't. Does anybody know what these 2 games are? You can just shout it out because we're in City Hall. Process here. No Robert's Rules of Order today. Braid is the game in the bottom right. What's the game in the top left? No Orbicular Drop better became known when it got turned into Portal. Yeah, that's Portal on Braid, y'all. Kinda, right? So my point here is that these games wouldn't have existed if they first didn't look like this. And so my answer to that question of where does the art come from is make functional stuff. Like set your level of art proficiency for your game at, can I tell that that's a helicopter? Can I distinguish that that's supposed to be a chair? And that at that point, if your gameplay is compelling enough, if it's interesting enough, if it can get some awards in front of it, it can get in front of some people and get people to play it, then it becomes much easier to get a giant company's attention, some funder's attention, some artists, some bank loan, whatever in front of it to say, okay, now this is worth really investing real money and power into iteration, polish, higher level of visual fidelity, and so on. And they can come in and replace those assets. But many, many, many games get made at this level, which weren't worth that level of additional work, and that's totally fine. But the mistake is when people dive straight into, okay, I need polished assets. And so they'll go to the asset store, they'll fill up their arms full of certain kinds of things, and they get in this weird bucket where they're trying to design around whatever they happen to find. And that's not really a good design process. That's not how this works. You decide what you're doing with your game, you make a terrible version that can tell that that's what that's supposed to be, and later on, if it's worth recruiting a collaborator and you have a fun game, it's way easier to do that when your game exists. We see a similar version in the programming world, and you don't have to see what's on the screen to make sense of it. This is a programming diagram of architected code. Worrying about how to do things out of perfect or right sense is a different answer when you're alone than when you're engineer 180 on a team of 300 people. There are certain processes that if you do them at a large company will get you fired, and if you do the opposite processes at home, you'll never get your game done. There are just compromises you have to make when you're working alone. You write a lot of very sloppy code you don't feel good about. Right is a contextual word. Correctness is a contextual word. Worrying too much about the proper programming style early on is generally a huge waste of time at best, and in other cases can actually cause you issues because you don't know how to wrap a prototype, because you don't know how to make those trade-offs of when and why it's worth doing these better kind of things at it. One of my favorite examples of this, to go back to that Braid example. So John Carmack, id Software, they released their code for a bunch of their old games, open source-wise. By the way, open source code for commercial games typically worthless as a learning resource, except to look at it and say, like, this code is awful, which many people did. Many, many people took to the forums in the 90s and so on for Doom and for Quake and so on to say this code is terribly written, this is spaghetti code, I could do way better than this, they said from their basements, including John Blow, the creator of Braid, who then at a talk later at Berkeley was like, I was on those forums complaining about John Carmack's code until he was shipping Braid and realized that there were so many situations where he had to make trade-offs between either I can get these 5 things kind of working in the consumer one and at the end of the day know the difference how I coded it, or I could kind of do this thing way more proper and also like not have time to do the other business negotiation, other sides of what I have to do. So those trade-offs happen, they're part of it. At the end of the day, unless you're being paid as a contractor to give someone a reusable code base or to sell a foundation of a kit on an asset store or something, you're shipping the gameplay experience, not the code. There are times and places for those trade-offs in which if it has practical benefit of helping you avoid bugs, helping you work on a team, that's one thing. But aside from that, learn when and how to cut corners is a only way to operate on a small team or alone. I'm a huge believer in deadlines. And sometimes people glorify this stuff, like Nintendo or somebody else, like, oh, it's done when it's done. Nintendo is sitting on a mountain of money that they could literally quit their business now, like stay in business paying everyone for 50 years, and then like start again and be fine. Like they're not in any rush, which sometimes people think on the short term, like, oh, 3DS is dying. No, it's not. They're fine. Deadlines are important. So Parkinson's law is this thing that says work expands so as to fill the time available for its completion. It's the same reason why if you've ever had a school week where you only had one worksheet to do, somehow that took you all week, and you didn't actually have any more free time. Now, the flip side of this is that if you have no deadline, work will expand to infinity to fill how long it takes to do. And an arbitrarily small project can just go on and on and on. And one of the challenges of this is that you never learn the finishing process, which whether you're recruiting, whether you're getting hired for a job, whether you're just trying to make more indie games, whether you're get onto a team, finishing stuff makes you practice different sets of skills than early on in the project. You're tying up knots instead of fraying loose ends and creating new options and questions. Many people will abandon their game saying that they think that they're about 90% done. They are usually nowhere near 90% done and have no idea what else is involved in the project because they have yet to have finished a project. They're usually closer to 50% because half of finishing a game is often cutting and throwing out a bunch of stuff that seemed like it was fine at the time. A game that's actually half done often looks mostly done, which is terrifying. And lots of that time goes into redoing, ripping out other sort of parts of the process that are worth learning. This is also important because some people have the impression that if they only spend more time on this first game of theirs, this can be their Flappy Bird. This can be their whatever the heck, where it's that's it. They finally made a game that was worth releasing, and that's how it works. More often than not, it's much more of there is a series of failures along the way. Each step of the way, you're learning different types of ways to fail, and that it's so much easier after you've wrapped it up, put a bow in it, stepped away from it, are no longer personally identifying with this project is me, where you can be like, oh, I'm such a moron. Why did I do that? And so then by Project 5, by Project 6, if you're Rovio, Project 51 for Angry Birds. If you're me, Project 55 for Topple. Then by that point, you've made so many screw-ups in past projects that you can increasingly not make those or foresee them and be clever about them in your more up-to-date work. Not releasing it until it's good enough is typically sort of a trap. Another thing I like to point out here is this is a Fred Brooks famous sort of mythical man month concept. This is back from OS 360 days, so increasingly not a well-known thing. Hopefully, people here have read this book or know what this is at least. Yeah, there's some people. That's what I'm talking about. Mythical man month, basically the idea is that if you have a building being built, and this is happening for places in the world, and they want the skyscraper done like tonight, right? They can throw enough more people at it, and kind of it can get done way faster if they double, triple, quadruple the people. They can smash these things out with physical projects. With code, it's much more gnarly. It turns out that every programmer you add slows things down because there's extra communication barriers, extra needs to document, extra needs to communicate, extra needs to do all these things that will slow you down and mess you up, extra layers of communication and business management and so on. Adding more people is often not an advantage. On small teams, often fewer programmers not only get it done faster, but have a better chance of actually finishing. There's less stepping on each other's toes. So I've seen, I gave a talk for some club and they were like, oh, well, we have this project that has 30 developers on it. Is that too many? And I was like, yes, that should be 10 teams of 3, and you'll have a better chance of finishing maybe 8 games instead of none. Anybody know what this is? Somebody older than me, question mark? Is that the Beatles? Boom, that's right, this is a Beatles concert. Hell yeah. Yeah, so the Beatles didn't wait until they were the Beatles to have their first concert. Like a lot of bands, they hustled like this for a long time with people bored and interested, not knowing who they were, inviting their friends and family, anyone they could get to come at it. And also a bit like the music or rock industry, you kind of have to work your butt off night and day for many years to maybe have that 1 in 10,000 chance of being the Beatles, because there are many bands which, in all fairness, are also doing this that probably won't be the Beatles. But that is the only way, that is the only path to doing it. This is one of my favorite little quotes. I'm probably going to say the exact same thing for the panel I'm on tomorrow. But this is the very first company I started, failed with a great bang. The second one failed a little bit less, but it still failed. The third one, proper failed, but it was kind of okay. I recovered quickly. Number 4 almost didn't fail. It still didn't feel really great, but it did okay. And number 5 was PayPal. This is Max Levchin, PayPal co-founder. My point being, it's not as though if only he had spent longer on the first company, it would have been PayPal. It's all those failures along the way that helped set him up so he made smarter decisions in his involvement with that next company. And so if your first projects will be bad, and they typically will be, and I think it's better to embrace it, then you don't want to make it your 5-year dream project, the one where, like, so all my life, I loved Neverending Story as a little kid. I've always had this thing like, Neverending Story, I want to do something kind of like that, but not that, because that's their IP and so on. But like, so it's like, what are my stepping stones there as opposed to ruining it, polluting it with beginner errors? You don't want a 5-6 digit budget for your first thing. I've seen people go that way and burn through their savings, and it's sad. Lesson from jiu-jitsu or judo or skateboarding or anything else, learn how to fall first. Learn how to tumble and not break your neck. Learn how to survive doing this so you can stick around and just keep doing it. There was a recent article on the web about, the startup market in Silicon Valley. They talked about being a unicorn. They talked about being whatever, the rhino, the sand dragon, all kinds of stuff. My favorite example is be the cockroach, which is how do you just make sure that no matter what else happens, no matter what the changes are, you're still doing it 5-10 years later. And that's what I am all about, which is why I've been doing this since the late 90s. I think the same thing also comes from mathematics, which is another field we all have a much better understanding of because it's been around so much longer in game development, where a lot of beginners will tackle a project too big or feel like they have a pressure to do something that's never been done before because why make Space Invaders? So many people have already done that. But you don't learn math by doing a problem no one else has solved. You do it by doing problems other people have done before. And you do it for quite a while building up to those problems to the point by working on projects no one has solved before, they're PhD people. But so, of course, like we see problems like this, not because someone else needs us to solve it, but because we haven't solved it yet. We see problems like this, not because someone else needs us to solve it, because we haven't solved it yet. And when you make your classic clones of things, not as a business model, not as a way to try to go out there and get sued like Mino did, making a Tetris knockoff, you do it because it's going to help fill your head with these classic proven patterns of how to code things that have practical appeal, have stood the test of time, have some basic core mechanics in there, and it's practice for its own sake, because that's what's going to help you internalize those skills to reuse those concepts in your later projects. This is Andy Rooney, semi-dating myself. This is from 60 Minutes. And he was talking about, in one of his many rants, how Pablo Picasso, before he was doing really crazy stuff, did some really recognizable, conventional, impressive stuff with technique that even a non-artist, non-curator, non-academic type person can appreciate. And he was just sort of advocating for, before we see the bizarre, crazy sculptures, before we see the bizarre, mule urine on the canvas, he likes to see some conventional project has come from that person. And I'm sort of that same philosophy. And I take that very literally. So my first games were very much Pong knockoffs, Breakout knockoffs, Snake knockoffs, and so on. And I think of these as transitional games, which is different from other kind of purposes. It's different from a project where maybe I do it because I didn't love Pong, I didn't love Breakout or Snake, but these are the kind of games that as a beginner I could mash out and then in the process learn some things. This is also a nice sort of feedback loop where if you're at a level of skill where you're like, well, I am so much better of a designer and programmer, I don't need to do that, then you could crack this out in an hour or two and prove your point, and other people will believe you. And until you've done that, other people won't, because we can't see inside your head, and we have no way to measure your skill. We judge ourselves by what we believe ourselves capable of. Other people judge us by what we've already done. And so you have to get those things out of your head and in front of other people for them to know that these are things, in fact, you are ready to do. And if only you'd replace your trees with better-looking trees, you'd have a team project from someone else. Now, 2D is often easier than 3D, and this is fairly commonsensical, unless you're in Unity. Unity was iterated on as a 3D tool for 8 years before it picked up 2D as a sort of like slapped on top, advanced 2D game-making platform. So if you need a 2D game with lots of animations, which is a big content barrier, lots of realistic physics, which only fits certain types of genres of games, Unity is a great tool for that in 2D. Otherwise, a simplistic, badly made 3D game is actually way easier in Unity than a 2D game in Unity. Now that said, the people I've trained who started with Unity typically at some point have been like, let's go back to not Unity for a little bit before we come back. And I take them into JavaScript, HTML5, Canvas kind of stuff where we focus on positions and code and handwriting your own collisions, because a lot of these foundational concepts, to the point that I no longer teach Unity up front as lesson 1, these are things that Unity tries to do for you. And it's people who really succeed at Unity typically have had a background before in programming, in ActionScript 3 and C++ and something else, where now it's helping to save them the heavy lifting of those parts of the task and focus on what's different. But they also have an idea of what it's doing for them. So when and if it affects their game feeling different, they can get in there, override it, and do it their own way. And these are things that otherwise form into your blind spot of reasons that are really hard to pinpoint. If all you've ever done is work in Unity, your game can feel very Unity for reasons that are really hard to put your finger on. So it's examples like Jeremy's example was showing, the keys naturally smooth your input. But they all smooth naturally the same curves, which results in this very floaty Unity feel. In certain kinds of responsive arcade-style games, you shouldn't do that. And so these are things that you become aware of, like, these are optional. These disconnects between what we see, how it works. And even to create a simple 2D platformer is enormously way more complicated in Unity than doing it in something where you're doing from scratch if you're taking kind of a light, quick, hacky approach to it. One of the other distinctions, and this is sort of a slow divide, out of the clubs that I've started, we've always had an active point of making this distinction, and the clubs that I've seen fail, that weren't mine, failed to make this distinction. But game developer culture is not the same culture as game player culture. We can get along with each other. We are mutually important. There is some Venn diagram overlap. But it is to say that as a developer, you do not need to be keeping on top of the latest reviews and launch dates and that kind of thing, or being really good at a certain kind of game to prove your credibility. It's just a different kind of thing. Any more than a novelist isn't reading every best-selling book being released this week. They wouldn't have time to commit to their novel. There's also an impression, and I think increasingly possibly an outdated one. So I interviewed many years ago Warren Robnick, creator of Atari Adventure, like the pre-Zelda Zelda-like game, where like the joystick moves your yellow dot, picks up the arrow to stab the dragon duck, and so on. And like he was when he went to go work at Atari for Adventure, his coworkers had zoology degrees, he had a math degree. Like computer science wasn't a field yet that he could have had before he worked at Atari. And then for a brief period of time in the 90s, at the same time we saw the indie scene die for a decade, and there's exceptions, but for the most part, for a while, Chris Crawford and those people could sell their games on a disc in Radio Shack in a Ziploc bag. And then more recently, we sell them on Steam or App Store or whatever. But in the middle, it was like the technology was good enough you could do impressive things, but only if you had a team of really, really educated, smart, clever people pulling off weird tricks on the hardware. And you needed a good CS degree, a good computer science foundation, a good computer engineering foundation for that. Increasingly, we've seen a shift. And if you pay attention to where the awards are going and coming from, and whether it's IGF, whether it's here at IndieCade, etc., away from some of the schools that have dedicated computer science foundational focus of let's code our own engine, and increasingly towards programs that are finding instead how do we use Unity or Unreal to make really clever design choices to tell the story world and create these characters and create this emotion and so on. And it's things where increasingly some of those tasks have been centralized or offloaded in some ways to those tool pipelines. It's not to say it's not worth learning, but it is to say that it should not be perceived as a barrier to, oh, I don't have the right credential, I can't do this. It is increasingly irrelevant in a good way. Also, and so this is relevant for folks who are maybe not going the education route, but doing their own learning about it. When you're new to something, doing it at all gives you valuable experience. That's completely legit. Like, I am doing it all. I used to not be doing it, so let's say I haven't exercised in a while, which is true. But when I get myself to start going to the gym again, I'm like, oh, I'm doing it. I'm going there. This feels great. I've crossed a barrier just by doing that. But if I keep that as my metric, I will quickly plateau and stay there. And so I run into all kinds of folks who they've been making games a long time, but they haven't continuously found ways to push themselves to the equivalent of like, oh, can I go further on the same time this time on the treadmill? Can I lift more weight? Or whatever metaphor is appropriate of how do you grow your skills in a significant way? How do you go from not a team project to a team project? How do you go from game jam sized games to weeks or month sized games? What is it you can do to push yourself? Maybe it's just changing the tool, but it's making sure you're not just doing it kind of idly as it's something I'm doing, but you're finding ways to keep stretching it. One of those, and this is one which often, we talked about an interview for the podcast coming out Monday, I believe. Game devs like you is a podcast I run with a Twitter handle and stuff. But we're talking about testing, which I think is oftentimes for total beginners not really that useful because like there's so much wrong with it that it's kind of even hard to like give feedback usefully besides just being like, go do more of this. It's like trying to give feedback on like a very, very beginning piano concert. It's like it's beautiful you did that, but like I just can't be seriously critiqued. But as you get more practice at it, and you have been doing it longer, it gets to the point where you have to cross that threshold where now you have to start doing playtesting because it's something worth playtesting. So here we see Battleship 88. This was the most successful game I had made by sheer download numbers, totally free game. Mainly in Brazil and the Czech Republic for reasons we never could figure out. This was like a different time in history. So, but so the American flag is over that plane because the U.S. planes that occasionally flew in to help you looked kind of like the enemy kamikaze and bombment planes and so on. And only through watching testers play did we figure out that the plane wasn't visually distinct enough that they would waste bullets and time trying to shoot at it. And so they were getting taken down. It didn't damage the plane, but it was distracting them, and we would only have caught that by putting it in front of someone who wasn't us. And sometimes we have this hang-up of like, well, I've spent so long learning to program and so long studying game design, what the heck does a playtester know that I don't? And what they know that you don't is that they have a fresh set of eyes, which no amount of experience, no amount of skill, no amount of money, nothing else can fix. You don't. You have seen your game since its earliest inception. You've seen every single version of it. You know how the jump mechanic used to work compared to how it does now. You can't get the same things wrong they will, and they are a much better representation of the strangers you put it in front of. And it's also just a way to help figure out, is your game polished? When you put your game in front of a tester and you won't explain it, you won't coach them, you won't show them how to do it first, and there's things where you wince or you want to explain something to them, those are signs you got to keep going back and working on more of that stuff, because you won't be there to wince and explain stuff to people after you release it. And when you take feedback, you need to not get too defensive. So this is, of course, a fun show where there's lots of people who are really, really angry about how bad they're being critiqued. You don't have to take all of it at face value. You can filter it appropriately. Maybe they're not your player base. Maybe that's fine. They don't have to know that. You don't have to win this argument with them. They're not going back and working on the same game. You don't have to convince them of anything. Listen to what they have to say, hear it out, appreciate it. They're giving you feedback because they think this is worth improving upon, and they have ideas. And those ideas are worth considering at least, and you can look for trends in them and so on. Now, the flip side of this is that there are humongous companies that have giant divisions of testing, user testing, processes, filters, layers between that and the development team and so on. They can A/B test with the general public at massive scale, and they can literally have that partly design aspects of their project for them as to whether or not this menu should be purple instead of blue and so on. That's not the scale we operate at. We cannot rely upon testing to answer our design questions. We have to still come up with lots and lots of confident, interconnected question answers as designers, and then still try to work out what we can through testing, and it's still totally valuable to test, but we can't anticipate that our testers will answer our questions for us. This is a harsh one. So next, I'm going to take a sip of water here. All right, marketing usually isn't the real problem. It's usually an excuse. There are a lot of people who say, oh, I made a game. Making a game wasn't the hard part. The hard part was marketing it. No, it's not. I mean, kind of. Like, it's a hard thing. Marketing is a legitimate skill, and it's why real companies hire marketing divisions, and people have, that's a talent. People go to schools and study and so on. But typically, so this is a bucket with holes in it because there's this example from many years ago where they talk about retention. So if tomorrow morning, by government edict, and let's say it's, we're living in the world in 1984 or something, everyone is forced to play your game for an hour. They have to. They're just going to do it. Everyone will see your game. They'll know what it's called. They'll have been in front of it. They'll have had the keyboard there, whether they touched it or not, or maybe a gamepad or something. then you think about how many of them will come back and ever play it again or talk about it again. And until you fix the problem of getting that number better than bad, it's not really worth marketing something, because you're losing people as quickly as you're getting them. You can put it in front of them, they won't get it. You can show them the video, they won't download it, etc. Even if it's a free game. The question becomes, how do we either improve retention, or people coming back to it, or people talking about it, or people wanting to share it? And that's just a different kind of, it's fundamental to the design of the project and the presentation of the project in a very different way than, oh, I just need to figure out who I can get to post my YouTube video and things, which is, again, a hard problem too, but usually it's several steps away from being the real problem. People use this as a concern. Now, speaking of that, we sometimes see these, the flip side of this problem is thinking, well, a good game will market itself. I'll put up my game on pay what you want, and people will be fair, and we'll see what they want. And the answer is usually they won't pay $0 or £0 in this case. Well, so this is the Radiohead. They could get away with this. They were established in a system that had music videos on the television and sold discs in stores. And so they had already established a certain value of expectation for what they're delivering on. They have a band that performs on stage at concerts people had already been to and bought t-shirts for. They can do this. If no one has heard of you, no one has heard of your game, no one has, etc., the answer is typically they want to pay $0. You have to find some way to establish value up front. So by the time it does this, they decide, okay, what's fair in comparison to the value they've already established, if and when that's, the level at which they are at. And it becomes a very different question if instead of making something and then saying, is this worth $3? You instead ask yourself, okay, well, we're going to try to make something that's worth X dollars. What does that mean? What do we have to put into that to justify that decision in comparison to other things people are paying for at that price point? And it becomes a much different kind of question. But at the end of the day, that business side is a whole different block than the actual game development. It's still, like I say, a hard task in its own regard. I don't mean to discount that. So Ramy's talk here last year talked about how it was basically like half of their business's work is running around doing all that kind of stuff. And we see the same kind of cases at Kickstarter, etc., where oftentimes someone's credibility or success comes from the world outside of there. It can be a useful tool for many of the rest of us, but it is just going to be a much different kind of fight than for people who've had their credibility established, in this case Tim Schafer, through the more conventional product distribution curation chains, where having a box on a shelf somewhere just wins you certain levels of respect and attention that having an app in the App Store does not. One of the things that happens and makes a big difference here is spending money to go to conferences. So good job, everyone here, for being at a conference, IndieCade in this case. GDC is another one. And it's something where if you're looking at doing this stuff at a higher level, whether it's just to better, more expressive, more artistic, more engaging, more fame by any metric, etc., or as a business, either direction, it's useful to proactively make and expand your professional network. Connections absolutely matter. They matter because they result in earlier access to hardware that beta isn't publicly available yet. They matter because they find about early deals or early opportunities where something's going some direction, and it's almost like insider trading. But the thing is that this isn't some sort of like game industry conspiracy. This is how every business in the history of humankind has ever had to work, because we're all a bunch of like squishy humans wandering around who kind of only sort of know stuff, or kind of only sure of certain things. And whenever there's something like NDA protected, I think people get the wrong idea that it's trying to guard these like really important gold nuggets from the public. Usually it's trying to hide the incompetence of all the things that they're going to have to decide to cut and kill before it gets released. But like those things are behind closed walls because they're not sure yet and they're trying to figure it out. It's not because they have something really precious they need people not rip off. It's because they don't want you to know how much they're going to compromise between now and what they can actually deliver on. But human connections matter. They matter for support, for mentorship, for secondary connections, for collaborators. Sometimes just seeds of ideas. Sometimes some of the best projects I've seen come out of misunderstandings where they saw someone else's game, they thought it worked like such and such, they thought they were making a clone of it, realized it had nothing to do with their game after all, and like, hey, I have my own thing. Now, there are things, and I have mixed feelings about discussing this at all, but I love these people. Let me start. This is a Tale of Tales. They recently, so for much of their, to my knowledge, artistic games career, they have made these beautiful things that in many cases are funded by government grants of one kind or another, or some sort of art-curated project of some kind or other, where the funding source is something other than paying customers. And then more recently, they had decided they're going to take an angle and do it as a commercial endeavor. They're going to make a game, they're going to put it on Steam, they're going to show they can do that too. That did not work out as well as they'd hoped, at least according to the Rant blog entry in which they were very upset. And I think it's important to point out that there are many, many reasons to make games, many ways to support making games. None of them are illegitimate or more legitimate than others. If it's through doing art grants and that's the kind of way to fund the kind of project you want to make, do that. Find that. Milk that, work that. If it's through academic research grants, there's money on the table there for someone to write an appropriate grant for to get paid to make this thing come into existence because someone needs it to exist. But it's a different kind of process, different context, different customer, different everything. than the how many people will throw money at you for X, Y, or Z kind of thing you put out there. And it's also an interesting case because these people have a lot of attention. They have mailing lists, they have visibility, they give amazing talks that are inspiring, but that was not enough to have sold a thing, because at the end of the day, they still had to sell a thing. And this is one of the other curious things we see in this effect, where Notch, despite having made Minecraft and everyone loving Notch, everyone loving Minecraft and having nothing but respect for that, has really, and I can't say this, I don't know him personally, but from all outside perspectives, struggled to make another game anyone else cares about. He doesn't get automatic attention of or he doesn't get automatic downloads or automatic sales because he has done this. The brand value has rapidly diluted to the point where there's so much new and interesting stuff happening where every year, people are all stepping up to the plate for the first time of how do we make things work in 2015, because the answer is different than it was in 2013, and so on. This is a recent, very important article in Salon called Sponsored by My Husband, Why It's a Problem Writers Never Talk About Where Their Money Comes From. This is especially relevant out here near Hollywood and Culver City, where it says by Ann Bauer for Salon. This is back in January 25, I suppose. And my point here, or her point rather, is that she's a writer, and many people will hear her speak at conferences and assume that because she's a writer, they've heard of her writing, they may own her books, that is her main source of income for her family or her house or her whatever, or her kids getting through school, and it's her husband who has like a high-paying job, which is not famous. And in many cases, so the equivalent here may be that in some cases indie developers can be sponsored by a spouse. There's nothing wrong with that, nothing legitimate with that, especially if it's the kind of project you see at IndieCade where it's artistically centric, and maybe its goal isn't maximum market capitalization or an IPO. This is also something where, in many cases, we're doing really boring, lame contract work. We're doing really interesting stuff. So for many years, people we've seen at IGF, people we've seen winning awards here in IndieCade, etc., between doing the artistic game they can't wait to tell you about, they're doing games they actually are under contractual obligation to not tell you about because it's like an ad web game for Coca-Cola or for like how to accelerate a car for a BMW to show off how powerful it is, or some cases not even game stuff. I've written software there's no disrespect to that guy either, he's a nice guy, but he helped keep my lights on in my little mobile home I was staying at the time, and that was like where you would browse through wallpapers for your desktop and click a button to go to the store to like that. Like I know how to write software, so someone could pay me to write software. Now I'm not going to talk at a conference about like how to write that desktop wallpaper download portfolio application, but that's where the money was coming from when I was making some of these games where like, I got a little game into IndieCade, but that game got me also $0. So it's useful to consider the money may not be coming from where it looks like it is. Most games lose money. Most of them. And I love this because this is like a lot of money, like a lot of games. And so this is very much applicable to say any other publisher model in the universe. Books, music, CDs, etc. The whole reason the publishing layer exists is because most of them go into negative cost on production, go into negative cost for their time. But the hits are such successful hits, such successful enormous spikes on the best-selling front store shelves that it offsets the ones that were bets that didn't quite pan out. And the way the publisher model works is so basically they dilute that effect. They say, we'll give you 5 digits something or other, 6 digits something or other, 7 in some cases, depending on your situation, team size and so on, depending on your time frame. And they'll keep your lights on, and then they absorb that shock out of whatever percentage of the end results you would get. But like, if it fails to meet that quota, you don't owe them back. It wasn't a loan, it wasn't a borrow. It was like, okay, we're going to bet on this horse. Go get him, Tiger. And if it fails, then like, okay, whatever, that's why they bet on a bunch of them. And so in the indie space, in many cases, indies who are going publisherless, the Danger Wild West style, where we get these very weird effects where we see ones who are enormously successful, which in a publisher-based model would have been diluted and they would have been less enormously successful. And what we don't see are the many other books on the shelves you walk past and don't even notice are ever there of projects that they would have been funded, but because they're a publisher model, just burnt through their savings to make it, which is terrifying. But is a thing to be aware of. And yes. Just to say, any one of those companies you've seen, any one of the developers you've seen make a successful game, pay attention to how many of them may or may not turn out another hit, because again, we're all starting from scratch with every single game, every single year. This is my first contract work. This is making a solar panel advertising game, which I'm not credited in. You arrange these blocks on a rooftop, and as you do, like the black clouds go away and a tree grows and doves fly out. You can earn points towards like a $100 discount on a solar panel in California. I think it still says you can do that, but that deal ended like 8 years ago. This to the right is Allison Bomberland. That was a publisher-funded deal. That's part of a 4-project thing where I made 2 projects for them that I'm like barely kind of visible in, that I know design control in, and 2 I was sort of working my design into. But anyway, so yes. There was a salary-wide interview recently, or survey for developers of how many so this is only people who self-identify as professional indie developers. You ask them, what do you do? They say, I'm an indie developer. And most of their earnings range from the $500 a year to $11K a year, which is like not livable money in Los Angeles. So you're going to need to supplement that personal project with contract work if this is something you're looking to do. And it's also something to think about. We're like, okay, well, is my work at a point where someone would pay me to program X, Y, or Z? Sometimes we get this imposter syndrome thing where we think the answer is no, but like the answer is yes, because you're still a better programmer than anyone else at their company, and they just need someone who can make a thing. But other times, like, well, if the work's not quite at a point where someone would contract you to do stuff, it may or may not be a point where you want to be contracting yourself to release a commercial project either. Something to think about. This is a David Halbsturm quote, which he says that being a professional means doing your job even on days you don't feel like doing it. So this was Topple. This was by far the most successful commercial indie scale project I've worked on. I co-developed this with John Nesky. He later on went on to work with that game company on Journey. And this was published through Moko, former coworkers of EA when I used to be at a Los Angeles studio for that. And this is a game where we released it in 2008 for iPhone, which is a good time to release for iPhone. And people had the idea, just like Trism and Super Monkey Ball, all you have to do is get a game on this device early on, and you're like, big money. Now, what they don't realize was at this time, Cocos 2D was like barely working on the platform to my knowledge. All the graphics here were like plain OpenGL. The sound library examples Apple had didn't work. There was a lot of weird stuff you had to do to make it work at the time at all. The barriers to entry were high. And sometimes as indies, we think low barriers to entry are good. And they're good if you're not making a commercial project. If you're making a commercial project, you want barriers to entry and you want to be on the other side of it. That is typically how that works. You want to be behind that wall one way or the other of doing a thing that's not yet easy for everyone else to do. Every single letter you see on the screen is a texture that I had to hand export from this font into a sheet and code my own OpenGL system for, including a bunch of umlauts for localization and other stuff. It was not an easy, comfortable thing to do, and many parts of it were lame, were boring, and so on. But this is the kind of thing that if you want to do stuff professionally, you have to figure out a way that after you're less jazzed about a project, you find some way to keep yourself working on it until it's finished. There will be a point where the rewards are not as quick as the rapid prototyping initial getting gameplay working phase, 24, 48 hours, where then for the next several weeks you're doing kind of a slog of just minor iterations, tweaking, testing, feedback, putting in systems that are less fun that normally if you were at a big company you'd hire some intern to do so you don't have to, and that winds up all being you. Making money almost always involves doing some work that no one else on the earth finds fun to do. If it was all fun all the way, you'd see a lot more people at least completing their games, let alone making money from the center. But if they quit when it gets to the actual work portion, it's just not going to get them where it needs to go. And it requires some good old-fashioned trudge up the hill, even when we don't feel like it kind of discipline. On small teams, typically, I stress that you got to be a leader, not the boss. Unless you are really pulling a lot of financial leverage to make the whole thing happen, you're usually the main reason why the thing gets done. You're usually the main reason cementing everything together. You're doing the most work, and this is also pivotal to make sure the vision's coming through in a way that actually aligns to what you're trying to take a bet on, because the real gamble is that boss up there doesn't have a whole lot to say over what direction that thing's going in. So in the App Store, and this is, I think, a relatively more recent number, if you're not in the top 100, but you're still in the top 1,000, remembering that there's 750 new mobile games released per day, so every single day-ish avalanche, and you hold that position in the top 1,000, between 100 and 1,000 for a whole year, you're looking at an average earning of about $7,000 a year. Just to say. That's from GameIndustry.biz. So one of the other misconceptions that people have, unfortunately, is that games are only worth doing if you do it as a business. So this is Thomas Kincaid. My mom and my mother's a huge fan of Thomas Kincaid. A painter of light, I think is his marketing branding thing. And now artists, curatorial people just like scoff at this stuff as totally kish. This isn't real art. Like it's all the same for snowy cabins or whatever. But it's like a very, very immensely successful business. This guy's business has pushed calendars like you wouldn't believe. There are calendars everywhere. There's shirts and mugs and logos. All kinds of probably like fanny packs and stuff. But that doesn't mean that's the only way anyone should paint a painting if they can sell like Thomas Kincaid. Clearly that's like kind of radically absurd. Or any more than anyone should only write poems or tell stories or dance, play an instrument, or do anything else. We as humans do it to express ourselves and grow creatively. That's part of why this is one of my role models, where he made very clear, like, anyone can do this. You can do this in a way that works for you and doesn't have to be your life's devotion. He's not teaching people how to start a business painting paintings. He's teaching them how to paint paintings so they can paint paintings, which is awesome. Now, a lot of people also don't realize Bob Ross technically taught speed painting. A real landscape isn't done in 22 minutes. It's just not. Real artists would look at this and just be like, I appreciate what he's going for, but like this is not art education. This isn't art school. This isn't going to make anyone a painter. You can't use the same technique for a portrait of somebody, right? You can't paint a bowl of fruit this way. This is really good for trees, for clouds, and for mountains, and for lakes, which, surprise, 400 episodes of trees and mountains and lakes and whatever. And so the same thing is, again, like, well, in the Indiescape, you got to figure out what's our version of speed painting where I've got a day job, but I can cram in maybe a few hours consistently a week, and maybe there's some sort of digital equivalent, and I think we see a lot of it around us, of what are our trees, our rivers, our mountains, and our lakes, and our clouds, and you'll see a lot of that going on. Again, there's ways you can cleverly work around that, but it's useful to be aware of it's speed painting and kind of accept that for what it is. This is one of my favorite examples. People know what this is? The screenshot's deliberately blurred and terrible quality, so you can't read it. Marriage, that's right. You know who made it? Half-Life on indie games is so short. There was a time when people I'd be like, who in the room has played Topple? And like half the people would have on their phone. Like 2 years later, who in the room has played Topple? Like no one had heard of it. So The Marriage by Rod Humble, so at the same time he made this game. So he's the blue square, his wife is the pink square, these other circles are strangers at a party or in their lives, and as they move about, their sizes change and the motions change, and it's this downloadable weird Windows thing about kind of the relationship dynamics on their social experience and so on. He talked about that at IGF and experimental gameplay and other things. While he made that game, which made him $0, he was also the executive vice president of The Sims for their expansion packs and stuff within Electronic Arts. And in some of the interviews, they're like, do you see some sort of like dissonance between you did this like clearly artsy, indie-ish, extremely indie thing, and you're helping to ship like new fabric couches and like new outfits for The Sims? And he's like, no, not at all. Like there's this thing he wants to make that's expressive, and there's no business to be built around what this is. And then somewhere else, there's people who want, there's a known consumer need for this thing as much as there's need for consumer need of McDonald's fries. And by being involved in that process and playing a key role in it from a business standpoint with spreadsheets, so when our meetings, whatever you got to do, you can pay your kids through college and afford a better place to live and so on, which you're not going to get by building this kind of thing. Now, also as a caveat on this page, which I try to find hilarious, at the bottom of it, where you can find The Marriage still online, Rod Humble's website, he says, all games appear by kind permission of Electronic Arts and Linden Lab. He's now the CEO of Linden Lab. He literally, as the vice president of this company and the CEO of this other company, had to give himself permission to work on these games in his off hours. One of the terrifying things we sometimes don't keep in mind is that when you're signing stuff, when you're working at a game company for your day job, sometimes they claim they want to own what you do outside of your day job. Now, in California, I believe it's California Labor Codes 2870 and 2872, because I care about what those are, they basically say that those are unenforceable if you're in your own hours, your own time, your own hardware, you don't involve coworkers from the company and so on, you don't involve their IP and so on. Now, the flip side of this is that lawyers, big companies are still really scary and probably have more money and more power than any LegalZoom, NOLO, $100 a month thing you're going to hire like I do. And so in that case, when I worked at EA, I was like, hey, so my friend's starting this casual web game startup. We're not doing casual games. We're building Wii games and Xbox 360 games and whatever. Kind of like talk to him about what he's doing, and they're like, no. And I was like, all right. Well, I made games for like 10 years before I came here. Can I release this PDF that I mostly wrote before I came here about the 10 years of games I made before I came here for free on the web with no affiliation connection to EA whatsoever? And they said no. And so I left the company. But like those are things that when they say no, like, what are you going to do? You're going to be like, oh, I'll take you to court. I'll show you, EA. Like, they just said no, which was the answer. Now, the head coworkers were like, just do it under the table. And I'm like, that sounds really scary. The flip side, ultimately, they probably wouldn't have cared, but like, it is scary. So anyway, there are people I know who, like, instead, they selectively will choose, like, their day job may be in software somewhere, but it's software that pays better, is more stable, doesn't get them fired if the market changes, of how things get funded, etc. And then in the evenings, they make the games they feel like making, because they can make the games they feel like making if they don't have to necessarily satisfy shareholders and customer demand and latest market models, etc. In my recent Los Angeles club, LAGameDevs.com, I focus on it as like pickup soccer style game development, where it's low key. People in the neighborhood are doing it. You want to be involved in it. It's like, hey, let's go out there and do that. And you can do that. You can play soccer. You can be a soccer player. You're actually playing soccer. You're not pretending to play soccer. But it is clearly a very different shape of your entire life trajectory than if you're trying to be a FIFA world-class player in the stadium, where there are different trade-offs made. There's different levels of investment made. There's different scary decisions and opportunities taken or missed or so on to do it in one way versus the other. They're both soccer players, but their experience of it is very different in terms of its healthy relationship to the rest of the things happening in their lives. Now, a lot of this maybe sounded kind of scary, and again, I kind of discounted up front. That's kind of the point. Robin Williams was asked by a reporter, when aspiring comedians ask him if they should be a comedian, what does he tell them? And his advice is, no, don't do it. Because he says if they have the drive to make it, they're not going to care about what he or anybody else says. And if someone quits just because he said that, then they weren't going to make it anyway. And he just saved that person from wasting a lot of their time. And so, if despite hearing all these warnings, you still want to go out there and do whatever the hell crazy thing you were going to do that it sounds like I warned you against today, go do it. And like, more power to you. Good luck, Godspeed. And then you can be like one of those other people I met at IndieCade, where he was like, years ago I emailed you and you told me I should make my first game simpler, but now my game's at IGF. And I'm like, congratulations, good on you. I like to believe that trying to prove me wrong helped you somehow. So anyway, it can be done. You can do it. There are people in the world who are doing it. You're seeing some of them this weekend, hopefully. It can also be done successfully as a business, but not if taken lightly. Know exactly what you're getting into, if you're getting into it, and then go get into it. So that's at the top of there is a link to you can code your first game tonight, totally for free in a few hours. It's a Pong kind of paddle-based 1970s genre of game with no affiliation to Atari or any other trademarks. CodeYourFirstGame.com. There's a new local club, LAGameDevs.com, that we have like steel pins and stuff for members. It's totally a real thing now. And then we have 16 members making 3 games at once. And then training on Skype is GameKeto.com, but I'll be honest that those applications have been closed for a while because my schedule is currently filled. But I will keep, I'll send out emails whenever those open up if you're interested. So that's me. I'm Chris. If you have any questions or anything, theoretically, I guess we still have like a few minutes-ish. Yes, in the back.
I'd like to know when you get your motivation from being able to do projects that are really hard to find time to do. I mean, you have busy schedules, family, kids, real jobs, and then all of a sudden it's 10 o'clock at night, and you can work until 3 in the morning, but then you can work, where do you get your motivation?
Some mixture of, staying up later than I should or waking up earlier than I should. I try to think of it like people who same motivation challenge is just going to the gym or to try to run a marathon or anything else. Like a lot of people find some way to pack in these weird hours of their life of like they set aside an hour, a week for this or a few hours for this. I also try to figure out like what can I do sustainably instead of how can I do a short burn, rapid, explosive 2-3 weeks burnout. It's like, okay, well, can I commit to like a few times a week, okay, one evening a week of just like constant forward progress, chipping away at it. I also tend to not be a believer that Zig Ziglar said that like motivation's not, people complain the motivation doesn't last, but he's like, nor does showering. That's why we do it daily. Big fan of that. But so like basically you want to find ways to minimize how much willpower it takes because willpower is a finite resource that gets drained through like just going grocery shopping or having a job or human problems of any kind and so on. And so instead it's like, well, how can I build a context in place where it minimizes how much of my cognitive load goes into creating the space, creating the habit, creating time, get some sort of ritual in place. Or so like part of why I started this club is that the context where we can kind of like, we gather once a week, something's going to keep happening. Someone's reminding you, like, hey, we need that model by Thursday. And like you're more likely to do that because the person's counting on you. And just finding a way to put yourself in that situation, I think, helps it kind of happen. Yes?
Go back to high school. Do you think it would be wise if they make game development mandatory as an elective as opposed to just kind of like you have to read and figure it out on your own and go this, pull this down? I mean, our kids are so techno-savvy anyway. Why wouldn't we just give them that kind of tool right out the gate when they need high school?
Literally, my talk 5 years ago at IndieCade was why game development should be taught in high schools just like woodshop. Where maybe it's not for everybody, it's an elective, maybe not everyone wants to take it, but as much as I took a science fair elective, there should be one for like, teach us some game programming stuff. Now, part of the challenge obviously is like this learning time gap as to what skills teachers have and what they're comfortable teaching and what they can answer questions on. Part of my video course at CodeYourFirstGame.com tries to answer those questions for them, and I also hang out and I check that forum twice a day to answer people's questions one-on-one. Like that's not just like YouTube video lists, I'm there helping people with stuff. But yeah, there's challenges there, like how to fit that in curriculum. The other thing about that space is how rapidly it changes, and universities still struggle with this massively too, where things that were a great answer approach 5 years ago rapidly become kind of like the old way of doing things, or the tools no longer supported, or the apps no longer run, and so it constantly has to be refreshed in a way that's different than solving an algebra equation, or than working with wood, or whatever, and those aren't insurmountable, but those are challenges, I think, into that getting pushed through, I suppose.
Should student game developers focus on making all of their games free so that they can get the most users, or should they focus on making $3 so that they can practice, creating value?
I feel like it depends on what they're students of in terms of their focus. If there's people who are really gunning for like my aim is to make this a business, in which case they need to be answering sooner rather than later how to get people to pay for stuff, and that might help inform questions. Now the flip side is if they're trying to establish themselves as sort of reputation or fame or other stuff. So Bing Gordon, EA co-founder, used to be involved teaching over at USC. I think he'd refer to it as like getting an A from the public, was like get 100,000 downloads. And also those are downloads, those aren't plays of a web playable. 100,000 web playable games are much easier to do than 100,000 downloads of a thing. But so those metrics are really useful to wave around. So we, as a group of students, we made a game, Vision by Proxy 2nd edition, played 7 million times worldwide. that helped any one of us if we wanted to connect to something else or be like, this thing was played by 7 million people. And if we would have put a price tag on it, would have been fighting tooth and nail to probably get dozens of them to people because we just didn't have access to people who would trust us yet. So it's obviously some challenge to be put out there. Maybe a mix of both to learn from both. But it's also something where the commercial value of a project is often not in proportion to the time it takes to make. Sometimes a very short game can turn out to actually have better commercial viability in the long run. So maybe it's like a game jam one. You just like, well, let's just dabble with it. I think one of the game jams one of my students participated in was like, the whole point was, can I make at least $1 from this? Can I get someone to do one sale of this? And that like formed like him thinking differently about his project than he would have otherwise.
Kind of building on that same principle of free versus like as you're starting up, theoretical you are now on game number 5 and you feel like you finally got something going, but games 1 through 4 show a steady increase from suck to less suck. But let's say your plan was every single time you're just going to release it to the Apple Store. If that's what you want to do, you want to use that as a metric for how successful you are. How long do you keep old projects in the spotlight? Whether this is old games that are still available for people to download, old songs that are still on your website.
So partly to a comical extent, so I try to run the balance here. So at the top of my little crystallion.com, I have like some 9 videos of some of the better known or better projects. And then I literally have an option to list every game I've worked on, partly because I just think it's hilarious. Where like there's just this train wreck of a mess of semi-embarrassing stuff. And partly because like who's it for? Like is there to share with friends and family? Show them everything. They're just proud you're doing stuff. Is it for like trying to get a job? Well, maybe I should click on the popular filter and send them a link to that, where there's like, oh, there's not as many of those by any metric. But find some way to maybe like kind of blended curation. But it totally depends on what angle you're going for. Now the other part is, you should be, if you're improving at stuff, constantly be embarrassed by stuff you used to do, right? That's your sign you're getting better at it. If you start to feel like, oh, all my projects are equally good, that's a sign you're plateauing. So yeah, so I also wouldn't take that as a sign like those aren't worth sharing. They're often still more than other people have done. Also, it might be useful just for diversity of portfolio, where let's say you're looking for contract work, someone may see one of your projects, be like, actually, we need something kind of like that. And if they only knew you could make a sliding puzzle game, which any of us could, but when they see you've done it, they're more likely to grab your shoulder for that. So hopefully, depends on what kind of thing you're going for, though. Yes?
How soon do you think it's worthwhile to start joining game development clubs and game together?
Super depends on the structure, time, and purpose, and goals and stuff. But so like with our clubs, my clubs, and these are modeled on the same thing I ran for Carnegie Mellon, Georgia Tech. We had people join who had started doing nothing ever before, and we find ways to integrate them like early on, build some level spaces, which anybody can rearrange working parts, and then kind of start learning from that. And then they start learning a little bit of coding scripting of like how to make these additional things work. Game jams can be a little trickier, although again, if it's a team setting, often they can find some way to like help us find free sound effects we can use, or help us give feedback on level design or something. But I'd say sooner is always better than later. And if it's a little uncomfortable, it's kind of embrace it, try to learn from it. But I wouldn't put up a barrier in front of yourself and be like, well, I need to do X before I go do Y, and that sort of sense. Because also, like working on teams is also just fundamentally a different kind of experience than totally solo stuff. The sort of solo training route that I train my people through on Skype really helps prepare them to be like a project lead, as opposed to anybody can kind of jump on as a collaborator. Because in some ways they're replacing placeholder stuff. Time. Okay, so I'm out of time. Thanks everybody. I've got cards and things if you want to get business cards.